The first day of that school was supposed to be a fresh start, or at least that's what I told myself on the walk there. My backpack was secondhand, the kind that had seen better days, the stitching on the straps loose, and the zipper snagged. At the top. My shoes were clean but worn, and my uniform, well, it wasn't the official one. It was a hand-me-down from a neighbor whose son had outgrown his, a few shades lighter from washing, and about an inch too short on the sleeves. But I walked in with my chin up, clinging to the quiet hope that maybe, just maybe, people wouldn't notice. Or if they did, they'd be kind enough not to say anything. That was naive. The hallways echoed with the noise of chatter, the squeak of sneakers on polished floors, and the occasional bell tone. I was just another student on paper, but I could already feel that I was different. Not because I was new, there were plenty of new students. No, it was something else. The moment I stepped into room 2B and looked up to find the teacher watching, me from behind her desk, I knew. Her eyes scanned me in a single glance, and what I saw in them wasn't curiosity. It was assessment, judgment, the way someone glances at fruit in a supermarket and puts it back because it's bruised. Her name was Mrs. Hartley. Her reputation had preceded her. People said she was strict, old-fashioned, but brilliant. Some parents even fought to get their kids in her class. I suppose if you fit her mold, clean, well-dressed, articulate, well-off, she welcomed you with that tight professional smile. But with me, that first look told me everything I needed to. No, she didn't expect much. And worse, she had already decided I didn't belong. I found a seat at the back, next to a boy who didn't speak to me. I didn't blame him. He looked like he already had a full roster of friends. As the class settled down, Mrs. Hartley began her welcome speech. Her voice was smooth, almost theatrical, the kind that filled a room. But even as she spoke, I felt her eyes drift past me like I wasn't there. Every time she smiled at another student's raised hand or complimented someone on their eloquent answer, I felt the contrast like a slap. When she finally addressed me, it wasn't by name. "You," she said, pointing vaguely in my direction. "Would you care to speak up next time, instead of mumbling?" I hadn't even spoken. I looked around, confused, until she clarified. "With the navy blue sleeves, yes. You." I nodded, a faint apology in my expression, though I wasn't sure what I was apologizing for. I didn't know then that it would be the first of many such moments. I just remember how the class turned slightly in their seats, some curious, some smirking, some indifferent. That was how it started. By lunch, the divide had formed. There were tables for friends, for athletes, for the well-dressed and the loud. And then there was mine, an empty corner of the cafeteria, where I sat with my homemade sandwich wrapped in wax paper, listening to the laughter echo off the tiled walls. I wasn't sad, not really. I was used to being alone. But something about that day felt different. The silence wasn't just empty, it was expectant. Like the universe was waiting to see if I would sink or swim. I told myself it would get better. That first days were hard for everyone, but deep down, I knew it wouldn't. Not here. Not with Mrs. Hartley narrowing her eyes every time she called. On me, always with that air of disapproval. Not with the students who had already absorbed her attitude, who saw in me what she saw. Someone less. Someone not worth the effort. But what no one saw, what even I couldn't see clearly yet, was that the very things they looked down on would be the things that changed everything. That day, I walked home with my head down and a knot in my stomach. But somewhere in the middle of that ache, something quiet stirred. Not anger, not yet. Just a promise to myself, a seed of something I didn't yet have the words for. I was going to prove them wrong, and they would never see it coming. It didn't take long for my uniform to become more than just a minor difference. It became a symbol, something others pointed at with narrowed eyes or sly grins when they thought I wasn't looking. The hem at the edge of my shirt had come undone by the third week of class, and I'd tried to fix it myself with a few uneven stitches and double-sided tape. I remember standing in the mirror that morning, hoping the shadows in the hallway would hide it, hoping Mrs. Hartley wouldn't notice, hoping no one would. But hope, I learned, doesn't hold thread together. It tears with one tug. That day, we were asked to stand and present our About Me projects in front of the class. Mine wasn't anything extravagant. Just a cardboard sheet with clipped pictures, hand-drawn lettering, and a story about how I wanted to become an engineer. I had written about my dad, who worked construction jobs to keep food on the table, and about the time I helped him fix the plumbing under our kitchen sink when I was 9. It wasn't polished, but it was honest. I stood up and walked to the front, holding the board against my chest like armor, and then I heard it, a muffled chuckle. I tried to ignore it. Maybe they were laughing at something else. But then came the whisper. Is that duct tape on his shirt? And then another voice, louder. Dude's falling apart like his poster. A small wave of laughter rolled through the class. Even Mrs. Hartley cracked a smirk. Not wide, not blatant, but enough for me to see it and feel it like a cut. I stood there frozen for a second, heart thudding in my throat. I didn't know if I should turn around and sit back down or push forward like none of it mattered. I looked at Mrs. Hartley, silently, asking for support. A word, a redirect, anything. But all she said was, well, if you're finished entertaining, perhaps you'd like to actually begin? The class laughed harder. That was the moment I understood something that no textbook could teach. When authority chooses silence, it becomes approval. So I spoke. My voice trembled at first, and the paper in my hand shook with it. But the more I spoke, the more I remembered. Why I had come here. Why I'd stayed despite the looks, the whispers, the empty lunch tables. I talked about the value of hands that work, about solving problems with what you have, not what you wish you had. I said I wanted to design things that made life easier for families like mine, who fix things instead of replacing them. By the end, the laughter had quieted. Not completely. There were still smirks, still whispers, but there was also silence. And some of them, just a few, looked like they were actually listening. When I sat down, I felt something strange. Not pride exactly, just a small crack in the wall that had been built around me since that first day, a breath of air through it. I thought maybe, just maybe, I had turned the tide. But the next morning, the whispers returned, louder this time. There was a photocopy of my presentation taped to the back of my chair, with DIY Trash King written in red marker. No one claimed it. No one had to. Mrs. Hartley walked past it like it wasn't there. That moment, I felt something shift in me. I didn't cry. I didn't lash out. I simply removed the paper, folded it, and kept it in my notebook. Not as a trophy, as a receipt, a reminder, because something was beginning to build inside me. Not just the pain of humiliation, but the fuel of something stronger, something clearer. A plan I didn't know I was forming yet, the kind of quiet fury that doesn't explode. It evolves. And when the time came, I would return every single laugh they gave me, not with words, but with results. After the poster incident, I began to realize that the cruelty of students was only half the weight I was carrying through those halls. The other half came dressed in a cardigan, with a clipboard in one hand and a passive-aggressive smile in the other. Mrs. Hartley never needed to raise her voice or call me names outright. She had a sharper weapon, sarcasm wrapped in professionalism, and worst of all, no one dared to question her. At first, it was subtle. Some students, she'd say, with a glance that stopped just short of my desk, should spend less time playing hero and more time learning basic grammar. Then it became routine. If I missed a word on a spelling test, she'd chuckle and murmur, "You don't need spelling to build pipe dreams, I suppose." The class would laugh, some confused, some gleeful, and I'd sit there pretending it didn't burn. She never said my name during those moments. That was her defense. But her eyes always found mine after the words left her mouth, and that was all it took. Her gaze was confirmation. Yes, this is for you. And no, you won't be able to prove it. One day during math, I had the answer to a difficult equation on the board. It was one of the few times I felt confident enough to raise my hand quickly. She ignored me. Let 3 others try and get it wrong. Then, when I was the last hand still up, she sighed dramatically and said, "Well, let's see what our residential underdog has to offer." The room erupted. Not because it was clever, but because it gave everyone permission to laugh. Not at the answer, but at me. When I got it right, she didn't even acknowledge it. "Even a broken clock," she mumbled, and moved on. It was a strange kind of isolation. Not physical, but psychological. When someone in power mocks you in front of everyone and no one speaks up, it creates a silence that's heavier than words. And it teaches the others something too, that it's okay to laugh, okay to judge, because if the teacher does it, it must be deserved. There was a girl named Alina who sat 2 rows ahead. She never laughed, not once, but she never said anything either. One day, as we passed in the hallway, she whispered, "I'm sorry," under her breath. I didn't ask why. I knew. It wasn't guilt. It was fear. No one wanted to be the next one singled out. That's how authority works when it's misused. It doesn't need to punish everyone, just one. Loudly enough that the rest stay quiet, but I never fought back. Not then. I kept my head down, finished my homework, did the extra credit. I told myself that if I worked hard enough, she'd change her mind, that maybe one day she'd look at me and see something more than the poor kid in the wrong uniform. Maybe she'd actually believe in me. But that day never came. Instead, what came was a growing pile of little insults that I collected like stones in my backpack. Each joke, each dismissal, each time she praised another student for an idea I'd already shared a week before. I remembered all of them. I wasn't angry, not yet. Anger comes from betrayal. What I felt was something colder, quieter, the kind of pain that turns inward and starts to calcify. The kind that stops expecting fairness, that stops waiting for applause. But something unexpected began to happen during those months. Beneath the sting of her words, I started to sharpen. I began reading ahead in our textbooks, watching free university lectures at the library, studying things we hadn't been assigned. Not because I thought she'd notice, but because I knew she wouldn't. And in her silence, in her cruelty, she gave me the one thing she never intended to: freedom. If I was going to be invisible, then I could build in the shadows. And one day, I would rise from them with something none of them could ignore. Not her, not the students who laughed, not the system that made kids like me feel like footnotes. Group presentations were supposed to be the one part of class where I could disappear into the background, let others speak, blend in, and not be noticed. But Mrs. Hartley had a different idea. She assigned the groups herself, carefully, methodically. And I knew, even as she called out the names, that mine wasn't a random selection. She paired me with the golden ones: Tyler, Jenna, and Marcus. 3 of the most polished students in school. Perfect hair, perfect handwriting, perfect lives, and perfectly aware that I didn't belong with them. From the beginning, the dynamic was clear. Tyler called the shots, Jenna took the credit, and Marcus made jokes behind my back, loud enough to sting, but quiet enough to be deniable. We were assigned a presentation on innovative environmental solutions. I came home that afternoon with a plan in my mind. I sketched out an idea for a low-cost water filtration device, inspired by something I had seen my dad build from old PVC pipes and charcoal. I wrote it up, made diagrams, even created a working prototype using scraps from our shed. I showed up at the group meeting proud, even excited. I placed the model on the table and explained how it could help rural communities get cleaner water for a fraction of the cost. Jenna didn't even look at it. Tyler smirked and said, "Cute, but we were thinking something a little more sophisticated." Marcus laughed and added, "Yeah, we're not building backyard toys here." They had already decided on their topic. A sleek PowerPoint about solar farms. All images pulled from the internet, all ideas taken from a popular TED Talk. I tried to speak up. I said we should include both ideas, make it about solutions for rich and poor areas. But they just stared at me, and Tyler said, "We'll handle the talking. You can do the bibliography or whatever." That was my role, the invisible labor behind the curtain, again. When presentation day came, they wore matching blazers. I wore my same stitched-up uniform, this time ironed with care, my prototype tucked under my desk just in case. As they spoke, the class nodded, the teacher smiled, and I could see my idea slowly vanishing in real time. Then, near the end, Mrs. Hartley looked at me and said, "And what about you? Did you contribute anything, or were you just along for the ride?" The room went silent. Tyler looked smug. Jenna avoided eye contact. And Marcus whispered, "You should have brought your toy." I stood up. My hands were shaking. I pulled the prototype from my bag and placed it on the table. I explained how it worked, how it could be built for less than $10, how we'd tested it at home and it had filtered the rust and mud from the water in our tap. The class watched, curious now. Mrs. Hartley listened, or at least pretended to. When I finished, there was a pause. Then she spoke. "That's interesting," she said, lips pursed. "But maybe next time, you could coordinate with your group before going rogue. Science isn't just about effort, it's about teamwork." That was her verdict, not praise, not encouragement, just a reprimand for daring to think I had anything worth saying. The group got an A. I got a note saying, "Lacks collaborative spirit." I left the classroom that day not feeling defeated, but changed. Something inside me had settled into place, a quiet certainty that I no longer needed their permission to be proud of my mind, that maybe the world outside this building, outside this teacher's approval, was bigger than I thought. Because while they dismissed my prototype as nothing, someone else someday wouldn't. And I would make sure of it. After the presentation, things didn't go back to normal, because normal for me had always meant silence, invisibility, and trying not to draw attention. But now, something had shifted. Not in the way others treated me. The mockery still lingered in the hallways, in the way Marcus would make sloshing sounds when I walked past, or how Jenna pretended to hold her nose as if I smelled like mud and pipe glue. But inside me, I had done something bold, and Mrs. Hartley had crushed it with one sentence, yet I couldn't let it go, and she didn't either. 2 weeks later, I was sitting in the back of the class working on a worksheet while the others were discussing some group project ideas. I heard laughter, then gasps. Someone had slipped a meme onto the class projector, a crudely edited image of my water filter, photoshopped next to a toilet, with the words, "Drink up genius" in bold letters. Laughter erupted, even from students who had never spoken to me before. Mrs. Hartley turned around. I expected her to scold them, to at least ask who had done it. Instead, she scanned the class, then looked directly at me. "Was this your idea of a joke again?" she asked. I blinked, stunned. "What? No, I didn't do that," I said quickly, but she didn't let up. "Only one student here insists on bringing props to class that weren't assigned. If you're trying to be funny, it's not working." The projector was shut off, and I was sent to the hallway. Minutes later, she came out with a pink slip in hand. "Detention. Friday after school. Maybe while you're sitting in silence, you'll learn there's a time and place for attention-seeking." She handed it to me and walked away. I stood there frozen, not by the punishment, but by the phrase, "There's a time and place for attention-seeking." It echoed in my mind for days. It became a kind of scar, because it told me everything I needed to know. That in her eyes, my ideas weren't bold. They were desperate. I wasn't being brave. I was being pathetic. A poor kid trying to play inventor just to get claps. And it hurt because a part of me started to believe it. I served my detention that Friday, alone in a classroom, staring at a blank wall while the sun dipped below the windows. The janitor passed by once and nodded. I wondered if he knew how many hours I had spent sitting silently in this school, being punished for trying to be more than what people expected. That night, I got home to find my dad fixing a leak under the sink. He looked tired. His hands were blackened with grease and rust. I watched him work in silence for a while. Then I asked, "Dad, if people laugh at your ideas, does that mean they're bad?" He chuckled without looking up. "Nope. Usually just means they're scared you might be right." And that was it. A sentence. A counterweight to the one she had thrown at me. Hers was meant to reduce me. His was meant to remind me. So I got back to building. Not water filters this time. Bigger things. Ideas. I started sketching designs for modular shelters, read about solar integration, applied for every scholarship and grant I could find in the library's old computers. I didn't tell anyone. I didn't need anyone's applause anymore, because now I had a reason. I wasn't going to prove Mrs. Hartley wrong just to get back at her. I was going to prove her wrong to save the place that gave me every reason to leave. It happened on a Monday morning, the kind of morning when no one expects change. Gray sky, stale coffee in the teacher's lounge, students dragging backpacks heavier than their ambition. I had barely stepped into the building when I noticed the difference. The hallways weren't louder, they were quieter, tense. Students whispered in clumps, teachers passed by with furrowed brows, and even Mrs. Hartley didn't bark her usual corrections about dress code or hallway etiquette. Then came the announcement, a voice over the intercom. Not the usual secretary, but the principal himself. Asked that all students report to the auditorium immediately after first period. That was never a good sign. We filed in, hundreds of us, some with phones in hand, others just confused. I sat near the back, my usual spot, unnoticed and out of the way. The principal stood on stage, clutching a paper in both hands like it was too heavy to hold alone. Behind him, the vice principal stared down at the floor, and even Mrs. Hartley had her arms crossed tighter than usual. Then he said it. "Our school is facing a financial crisis," he began. "Due to recent budget cuts and a decline in enrollment, we are at risk of permanent closure by the end of the academic year." Gasps. Cries. Someone dropped their phone. Others looked around in disbelief, as if waiting for someone to say, "Just kidding," and put things back the way they were. But no one did, because this wasn't a drill and it wasn't a rumor. It was real. The school, our school, was dying. For a moment, I felt nothing. No panic, no fear, just stillness. And then slowly, a strange mix of emotions began to rise inside me. I should have felt bitter. After everything I'd been through, after all the ways I'd been ignored, mocked, and shoved aside, Maybe I should have welcomed the collapse. Let it all fall. Let them see how it feels to lose something. But I didn't. Because for all its cruelty, this place had also been my crucible. It was where I'd learned how to survive, how to resist, how to build in silence. And it was still full of people who hadn't done me harm, janitors who gave me extra minutes in the hall, the librarian who let me stay after hours, the few quiet classmates who'd nodded at me instead of laughing. This wasn't just about a building. It was about a space where forgotten kids like me still had a sliver of a chance. As the assembly ended, people swarmed in small groups, asking questions that had no answers. What happens to our credits? Where? Will we finish the year? Will the teachers lose their jobs? I walked out without a word. My mind wasn't on the chaos. It was on a plan, because I remembered something most of them didn't. My prototype, my rejected idea, and the other ideas I'd built since then. Not just for water, but for infrastructure, energy, basic survival. What if those designs could become more than blueprints? What if, instead of waiting for someone else to fix it, I could? Not alone, of course, but with the right people, the right connections, the right pitch. That afternoon, I skipped lunch and went to the library. The librarian looked surprised. She said she expected students to be at home, panicking. I just smiled and asked if I could use the computer. I began drafting something. Not a letter, not an essay, a proposal, a full presentation, with models, statistics, sketches, everything I had never been allowed to share in class. I called it the Phoenix Project. Not because it sounded cool, but because I knew this school was burning. And maybe, just maybe, we could rise from the ashes. I didn't know how yet, but for the first time I wasn't trying to prove anything to Mrs. Hartley or anyone else. Was trying to save something, and that changes everything. The next few days were a blur of silence and determination. While most students wandered the halls with confusion or met in panicked clusters whispering about transfer applications and unfinished transcripts I was building, not with my hands this time, but with everything I had gathered in my mind for the past year. All the scraps of knowledge I had stored away in notebooks, sketches, late-night readings, and the dozens of quiet afternoons spent watching my father fix what others had thrown away. This was no longer a science project. This was survival. I called it the Phoenix Project because it felt like something reborn from what everyone else had already buried. The idea was simple, bold, naive maybe, but real. My school didn't need to be saved by pity. It needed to be useful. We sat on acres of land. We had rooms that could be converted into workshop spaces. We had unused rooftops perfect for solar installation. And most of all, we had students. Dozens of students like me, overlooked, underestimated, but full of ideas no one had ever bothered to ask for. What if we turned the school itself into a sustainable learning center? What if we pitched it as a pilot hub for eco-education and community? Utility, a place where students could learn not just by reading outdated textbooks, but by building real systems? Rain collection, solar grids, urban farming, low-cost filtration, real solutions built by real kids for real communities. I compiled everything, renderings, case studies, cost comparisons. I used the public library's printer and stapled it, all together with a borrowed clip. And then, for the first time in my life, I voluntarily asked to speak to Mrs. Hartley. She looked at me from behind her glasses like I had grown a second head. "You want to what?" "I want 5 minutes with the principal, that's all I'm asking." She folded her arms. "You're not in trouble. Why would he meet with you?" I placed the thick proposal on her desk, right on top of her lesson plan. She glanced down, saw the title, The Phoenix Project, and scoffed. "I don't have time for stunts," she said. "It's not a stunt," I replied quietly. "It's a solution." She said nothing. I left, unsure if the proposal would even make it past her trash bin. But 2 days later, I was called to the office. Not for detention, for a meeting. The principal sat across from me with the proposal open. Half the pages already marked with yellow tabs and underlined notes. His eyes weren't judging. They were curious. "This is a lot," he said. "I know. It would take money. I included funding sources, grants, community sponsorships. There are organizations that pay for this kind of pilot program. And you think high school students can build this? I don't think we have a choice." He didn't laugh. He didn't dismiss me. He nodded slowly, then asked, "How fast can you gather a team?" My heart thudded in my chest. He was serious. I left that office shaking, not from fear, but from the weight of it all, the weight of finally being heard. By the end of that week, I was given space to present the project to a panel of faculty and select students. For the first time, my water filter prototype stood beside solar layouts and hydroponic blueprints. I spoke clearly, not to impress, not to get a grade, but to ignite. And something strange happened. People listened, teachers nodded, a few clapped. Even Mrs. Hartley sat at the back, arms crossed, but this time she didn't interrupt. After the presentation, the principal stood and said, "This might just be our best chance." That night, I didn't sleep. Not because I was nervous, but because the silence was too loud. For the first time, the silence wasn't about shame. It was possibility. The school had mocked me, punished me, ignored me. Now they were counting on me, and I wouldn't let them down. It was a week after the presentation when Mrs. Hartley knocked, on the side of the open workshop door. I was in the middle of explaining the solar wiring schematic to a junior who'd offered to help during lunch breaks. The wiring was delicate, and we didn't have the tools we needed, but somehow we were, making it work. When I looked up and saw her, I thought for a moment I had imagined it. She had never stepped into this part of the school before, not voluntarily, not into the makeshift lab we'd transformed from an abandoned AV room. I wiped my hands on a towel and motioned to the student beside me that I'd be right back. Mrs. Hartley stood stiffly in the doorway. No clipboard, no sarcasm, no usual air of condescension. "I heard you were installing the panels this weekend," she said flatly. I nodded. I've been organizing a parent-teacher fundraiser. There's been interest, but some of them have questions, and I think it would help if they heard about the project from you. She didn't say please, but the fact that she was asking at all, asking me, was more shocking than if she had. I tilted my head slightly. "You want me to present?" "Yes." "To the same group of people you said I was wasting time trying to impress?" She hesitated, just for a breath. Then, "Yes." A silence stretched between us. The same kind that used to carry judgment, punishment, imbalance. But this one felt different. This one felt awkward, vulnerable. "I'll do it," I said, "but only if we're honest about why the school needs this. I'm not doing this to prove a point. I'm doing this to keep the lights on. Literally." She blinked, and for a moment I thought I saw something soften in her face. Regret? Maybe. Or maybe just a glimpse of the truth she had refused to acknowledge all those months ago, that poverty was never a reflection of worth, and brilliance could come wrapped in worn shoes and a threadbare shirt. "Understood," she replied. She turned to leave but paused in the doorway. "I was wrong about you," she said without facing me. "About a lot of things." I didn't answer, because in that moment, I didn't need to. That Saturday, she stood in the back of the community center while I presented the Phoenix Project to a group of concerned parents, donors, and even local reporters. I watched as they leaned in, eyes wide, questions sincere. For the first time, the school wasn't just surviving, it was inspiring. And Mrs. Hartley? She clapped, not politely, not because she had to. She clapped like she meant it. Later that afternoon, as we installed the first row of solar panels on the gymnasium roof, she stood by the scaffolding, holding the tool bag for a student who used to be failing her class. She didn't shout. She didn't correct. She supported. That, more than any crown or award, felt like justice, not revenge, restoration. Because the most powerful kind of vindication isn't humiliation returned. It's transformation witnessed. She had tried to define me by what I lacked. Now she was standing beneath the power I had built. And that was enough. It was the last Friday of the semester. A day most students counted down to, hoping for time to pass faster, desperate to break away from the gray walls and fluorescent lights. But this time, the halls weren't filled with kids looking to escape. They were waiting for something that hadn't happened in years. Something one thought would happen again. An assembly had been called. Not for discipline, not for bad news, but for celebration. The Phoenix Project was complete. I arrived early that morning, before the sun, standing outside with a cup of instant coffee in my hand, watching the solar panels blink to life as daylight crept over the horizon. The school wasn't just powered, it was reborn. The rooftop glistened with new life. The rainwater tank stood clean and tall behind the gym. The garden, once a patch of weeds, now sprouted vegetables planted by kids who had never touched soil before. The old AV room had been converted into a learning lab, our learning lab. Students who had once been labeled troublemakers or remedial were now the ones giving demonstrations to visitors. Teachers who had once stayed late grading in frustration now stayed late helping. Build. It wasn't perfect, but it was alive. We were alive. And now, the whole school would see. The auditorium filled slowly but noisily. There was a buzz in the air, not from gossip or drama, but from anticipation. Something real, something earned. I stood backstage, holding the remote. That would trigger the slides on the giant screen. My palms were sweating. Not because I was nervous, but because this moment meant something more than grades, more than reputation. It meant legacy. The principal opened the assembly with a short speech. He didn't talk about test scores or district rankings. He talked about resilience, about how schools aren't just brick and policy, they're people, about how transformation doesn't come from the top down, but sometimes from the least. Expected places. Then he handed me the microphone. I stepped onto the stage, and for the first time in my life, the room stood still. No laughter, no whispers, no taunts, just silence, listening, watching. I started with a photo. The first slide was of me, a year ago, standing in front of a rusted faucet in my backyard, holding my first water filter prototype made from an old plastic bottle and charcoal. The room exhaled, confused. Why that? Because that's where it started. I walked them through it all. The rejection, the humiliation, the project, the plan, the team. But I didn't center myself. I centered the journey, the collective rebirth. I showed them what the school looked like now, how much money we had saved already in energy, how the local newspaper had written about us, how 2 colleges had reached out asking to replicate our pilot program in underfunded districts. I saw teachers cry. I saw students who had mocked me lower their heads. And I saw Mrs. Hartley, wiping a tear from the corner of her eye. I closed with a simple message. This place taught me pain, yes, but it also taught me how to fight for something more. I was told I didn't belong, that I'd never make it, that my place was silence. But today, I stand here not in revenge, but in renewal. This is our school, and it's only just beginning. The applause didn't come all at once. It came in a wave, starting with a student near the back, then another, then the staff, then the room. They didn't just clap. They stood, for me, for the team, for the school. And in that moment, I didn't feel like the poor kid who once sat alone in the cafeteria. I didn't feel like the joke they used to whisper about. I felt seen, respected, whole. As I stepped down from the stage, dozens of students reached out to shake my hand. Some of them I barely knew. Some of them had once been the loudest voices mocking me, but now, their voices trembled. Their eyes were honest, and I realized something. They weren't applauding me. They were applauding what I represented. Hope. After that assembly, the school was never the same. But more importantly, neither was I. The very building that had once been a symbol of exclusion, mockery, and invisibility became the place where I discovered my worth. Not because someone gave it to me, but because I built it, one part, one plan, one panel at a time. The week following my presentation, news crews arrived at the campus. The local station aired a segment titled, "The Student Who Brought Light Back to His School." I didn't even know they were filming during the event. I found out when I walked past a shop window and saw my own face playing silently on the TV inside. But more than that, letters started arriving. Not emails, actual physical letters. From school districts in other cities. From teachers in low-income neighborhoods asking for our schematics. From students who said they had watched my speech online and were inspired to start their own initiatives. One from a boy in Kansas simply read, "I thought I was the only one who got laughed at for trying. Even the district board called." At first, I thought it was some formal reprimand, a bureaucratic delay. But they wanted to meet, not to scold, but to fund. They were offering grants to replicate the Phoenix Project in 5 other struggling schools. They wanted me to help design it, as a high school student. But the moment that hit me, hardest didn't come with applause, or cameras, or officials. It came 2 weeks later when Mrs. Hartley knocked on my workshop door again. She wasn't there as a teacher this time, not really. She brought with her a man in a blazer with a clipboard and a warm smile. "Michael," she said gently, "this is Mr. Rains. He's from the State University's Engineering Outreach Program." Mr. Rains stepped forward. "I've reviewed your work, the schematics, the execution, the community impact. It's remarkable. We'd like to offer you a full academic scholarship starting next fall. We usually don't grant these until after high school graduation, but," he smiled wider, "some rules are worth breaking." I stood frozen. A scholarship to a place I never imagined I'd even visit? Tears welled in my eyes. Not just because of the opportunity, but because it was real, tangible, mine. Mrs. Hartley looked at me then, not with guilt, not with pity, but with genuine admiration. "You changed this place," she said quietly. "You changed me." I believed her, and for the first time, I allowed myself to forgive her. Not because she asked, but because I no longer needed her apology to know my value. The day I packed up my things for college, I walked through the school one last time. The hallway felt different now, wider, brighter. The solar panels outside caught the morning sun and cast long lines of golden light across the walls that once held shadows of shame. Students passed by and nodded at me. Some smiled. One girl, a freshman I didn't know, whispered, "Thank you." And I realized I hadn't just saved the school from closure. I had lit a spark that wouldn't burn out. A spark that told every student who was ever told they didn't matter, that they did. That their ideas could grow roots, that their voice had power. That dignity wasn't something others gave. It was something you claimed, through courage, through kindness, through persistence. And that sometimes, the ones who are laughed at for dreaming are the ones who rebuild the world.